So you are listening to Your Rights at Work with Chris Garlock and Ed Smith here on WPFW. This next story, I got to tell you, when I first heard about it a couple of weeks ago, it was one of those things where I was like, I just didn't get it. It just seemed like such an odd thing. But then I will say it's Virginia, so I wasn't completely shocked. But basically, it boils down to Virginia's labor history, of all things, being under attack. And I'll just point out that things like what Angelo and Ed are going through right now, I mean, right now, what they're doing is news. But in, a couple of years, it'll be history. And the question is, who gets to find out about these things and how? So to shed a little light on this strange but true story out of Virginia, we're joined now by Shane Riddle. He's with the Virginia Education Association, and Brian Peyton. He's with Teamsters Local 322. Shane and Brian, welcome to Your Rights at Work.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you, Chris.
So guys, this is just give me the short version on this. I mean, Virginia's got so many serious problems. I was not aware that teaching labor history was one of them. Can you enlighten us here?
Well, actually, could I start off?
Yeah, go ahead. That's Brian.
Yes, Brian. Yes, I'm sorry. Let me start off just for a second. First and foremost, stand in solidarity with our brother trying to organize a union with Brother Angelo. But some of what he was talking about actually really hit home for me personally. And we'll give everybody here like a very quick and brief history lesson. The Black nurses at the University of Virginia Hospital attempted to unionize. And in 1946, those actions prompted the General Assembly to pass a ban on public sector collective bargaining. So you see all this stuff is interconnected, so to speak. I would say, and Shane has seen this, the pushback from the proposed changes to the educational standards that seek to remove any mention of labor history and also the close connections to the civil rights have been met with a resounding no. We've seen an immense show of solidarity. We've had unions from all over connecting, if you will. Obviously, the Teamsters, SEIU, VEA, AFT, TME, the AFL-CIO, Stillworkers.
Brian, we're losing you off mic there.
Said the AFL-CIO, Steelworkers, we've had a whole bunch of unions participate in this. There have been 6 hearings that have taken place across the state. They initially started in Jamestown, Mount Vernon, Roanoke, Charlottesville, Abington.
And again, Brian, we're having a little bit of a mic problem. Let me just jump in. And also let me bring Shane. So that's Brian Peyton. He's with Teamsters 322. And then we've also got Shane Riddle on the line with the Virginia Education Association. And Shane, if you can just sort of...
if you can you tell him to exit out and dial back again?
Perceived problem and who has a problem with labor history. And let me just sort of frame this, because as somebody who leads labor history tours here in D.C., one of the things I know is that many people tell me that when they were in, high school, even college, if they got any labor history at all, it was usually, 10 minutes, maybe one segment. So it like I say, to me, I thought the problem was we didn't have enough labor history in the schools, but apparently I was wrong.
Well, Chris, listen, I have a labor studies degree, and I did not really dive deep into the labor studies and understanding labor history until I attended college. Now, we learned a little bit about it in like high school, but then those prior grades, hardly anything was taught as far as labor history. Now, in Virginia, 2015, the 2015 standards included some history on labor, but really not enough. And now the proposed learning standards that are currently being proposed here in Virginia almost entirely delete labor history totally, including language around the rise of organized labor and European industrial revolution's impact on labor unions and working families, including women and children. And one thing, there is good reason, right? Excellent reason, really, for us to teach labor history in our social studies classrooms. We want our students and our young people to study the contributions of generations of union activists, right? And we should teach our students the lessons of how union members helped democratize America, particularly during the New Deal era when the labor movement created active voters and engaged citizens out of millions of blue collar workers. And most of them were disenfranchised workers. And so we feel like that, this should be a most priority for the Virginia Department of Education to include these lessons in their curriculum framework and standards. And so that's what we're pushing for. That's what we've been pushing for. And Brian, with the Teamsters and other unions that we partnered with through the Unity Table here in Virginia, have done that. We've held 6 to 7 hearings around the state so that we can have our voices heard on recommending insertions into the standards for grades, at least through grades 6 through grades 12 for sure. And so it's very, very important, Chris and Ed, to include this labor history. And the board is going to meet on April the 20th they're slated to meet on April the 20th. It could be postponed to a later date because of all of the action that we've had around this issue. So if it is on April 20th, we'll be there to make sure that labor history is included.
I want to bring Ed in and get Brian back in, but I actually want to go back to something that Brian raised. The first thing that Brian talked about was a history, which frankly I was not familiar with, but some stuff that happened with Black nurses back in the 40s, right? And what I'm wondering before I bring Ed in on this is what is the rationale for not teaching for taking this out? What is? I mean, they always have to have a cover story, right? So I mean, so what's the cover story here? That's a question for you, Shane.
Oh, it's a question for me. Okay, yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, I can shed some light on that from my perspective. The labor unions and labor history, listen, to me, should be no more exempt from critical history study or historical study than corporations. Right. In fact, union history shows that labor organizations have made much more progress in including women, immigrants, African Americans, and Mexican Americans than any bank, law firm, or other corporation. And I think that balance, there is an intentionality to taking away that balance between labor unions and corporations in the employer and the employee relationship and the balance there. And so that's the way I look at it. And I think in some ways it's intentional, and we just have to make sure that it's great that we noticed this early on so that we could raise our voice and get involved, because if we don't, then there's no balance anymore between the worker and the corporation. So that's kind of the way I look at it. Brian may have a different perspective on it, but I'm pretty sure we're aligned.
Shane, actually, can everybody hear me okay now?
No, much better, Brian. Much better.
Okay.
Go ahead,
Thank
brother.
you. Okay, so I actually want to build on what you just said, Shane. And the funny thing is, I recently went with my daughter's class to a field trip. My daughter's in first grade. We went on a field trip, and we actually went to the Air and Space Museum. And so obviously the Air and Space Museum focuses on advances in aviation and also, trying to put people in space. But with that being said, I noticed a couple of exhibits that really stood out to me. And one of them in particular was focusing on once upon a time they used to be called stewardesses now, but flight attendants.
Yep. Thank you.
And yes. And so, but I need to throw that out there to obviously explain the history behind it. So I bring my daughter over and I say, listen, my daughter, she knows what I do. She knows about unions. She understands it. And as a matter of fact, she understands like the whole brother, sister solidarity thing. So anyways, I bring her over. I say, Tesla, come over. I want to show you something. She said, okay. So I bring her over and they've got this nice mural. They have something there about Dr. King and obviously the civil rights movement. So she knows all about Dr. King. And she says, oh yeah, Dr. King. And her face lights up. So then I point point to the breakdown of the flight attendants. And I said, well, once upon a time, flight attendants, there was no marrying allowed within the aviation industry. And guess how that was changed? Because a grievance was filed. I think they proved that it was a violation of Title VII, and ultimately that changed. Once upon a time, there was standards like, hey, you could only be I'm going to use the old term, a stewardess, if you were young, thin, attractive, and Caucasian. That changed. And so, for me, that was really a pivotal moment, sitting there, walking through this museum that for the most part doesn't have a whole lot to do with civil rights, but you can see the imprint that unions have made all throughout the world, so to speak. Does all that make sense? It's like it was a very, very powerful moment for me. And then there was another exhibit just talking about an individual that wasn't allowed to do certain things because of, various reasons. And so for me to kind of build on what Shane just said, I think it is incumbent upon us to push back on this, which is what we're doing. Labor history is our history. And I think that it's important for the governor and anybody else to realize that working people in this state, in this country, in the world, they deserve to have their story told. One last point that I want to make is you go back to when the pandemic started, okay? Oh, thank God for you. You're essential. You're the one that's moving freight. You're the one that's delivering our medical equipment. You're the one that's doing all this stuff. And they were going around saying that we're heroes and we're doing this and we're doing that. Well, I think somebody previously stated in the show that things that are happening now become history later on. I'm paraphrasing it. So is it not important for us to remember the legacy that blue collar workers played and unions played in keeping this country going when we were facing a pandemic? That's a very vital piece of history. And I think it needs to be shared and it needs to be celebrated.
Absolutely. You're listening to Your Rights at Work with Chris and Ed. We're talking about Virginia's labor history is under attack. We're talking with Shane Riddle. He's with the Virginia Education Association. And also, you just heard Brian Peyton. He is with Teamsters 322. Although, I don't know, Shane, sounds like you could probably sign Brian up for a VEA membership. He sounds like a pretty good teacher to me.
Well, listen, we appreciate our brothers and sisters. With the Teamsters and all the other unions too on our unity table. That's our labor coalition here in Virginia. And, if we weren't as united as we are, we couldn't get the things done that we need to get done as far as labor goes. And you know what? The question you asked me earlier on, why is this being done? Why are we taking labor history out in the proposed standards? Well, to me, I gave you my perspective, but it's about democracy. It's really about democracy. By studying labor history and the labor movement, this is the only good way to counter a limited notion of citizenship and a restricted concept of democracy. I think that really is all that it comes down to. Making sure that workers have that voice, and making sure our students and young people understand that history and how it relates to the way that we cannot restrict democracy, and democracy is really under attack in this country. It has been under attack for years, but most recently more than ever.
It's first of all, Brian and Shane, thank you so much for coming on. And I wish we could stretch out the time a lot longer. I had a ton of comments and questions, but I wanted to just, first of all, hey, why should we listen to teachers about what to teach? That's number one off my brain. Number two is, I'm a big believer in history, warts and all. And Brian talked about Black nurses trying to organize in the 40s. I'll guarantee you that the labor movement in the 40s were not supportive of Black nurses. And I think that should be taught. We should know our history of racism in the labor movement. That should be taught right along with our ability to provide people with better working conditions and better raises. One other comment I want to make in terms of education: get your butt down to Birmingham, Alabama, and go see the Legacy Museum. That'll affect you for the rest of your life. Whether you're black, white, green, yellow, purple, I don't care. It is an amazing experience, and our national union has committed to going every year. I went in 2015 and 2018, and I have to tell you, there were moments I had to walk away from the group and just silently cry. It is devastating, but it is so important. I think that every school child should understand what happened in Birmingham in 1965, and then certainly the legacy of slavery, the legacy of incarcerating black men and brown men and black men and brown women. So those are my comments. I'm sorry you don't have a question, but you guys brought up a lot in me.
Well said.
Thank you.
Can I make one final point?
Yes,
Can I
please.
make one final point?
You got it, Brian. You're going to close us out, brother.
Okay, well, thank you. I'm honored. So, a lot of people I don't think really fully understand this, that President Jimmy Hoffa and Dr. Martin Luther King had a pretty close relationship. And so, with that being said, there was a lady, her name was Viola Lizuo, if I'm pronouncing her last name correctly. Forgive me, I'm getting a little tongue-tied. And she was a 39-year-old woman from Detroit who was murdered on March 25th, 1965 by the KKK. She was actually in Alabama volunteering for the Civil Rights March. The reason I'm sharing this with you is because I have in my office, I keep a photo of a bunch of people gathered at her funeral. And you have Dr. King, you have Jimmy Hoffa, you've got James Farmer, a whole bunch of different people that are actively involved with the civil rights movement, sitting here mourning this woman's death because she was so happy, so involved with this, and her husband was actually a business agent for the Teamsters, if I remember correctly. And so I think it's important that we remember, and we also celebrate the fact that labor rights and civil rights, they go hand in hand. They go hand in hand. You know, a lot of the advancements that have been made in this country are a combination of the two. And as I said before, Dr. King and Jimmy Hoffa, they had a relationship. And I just think that needs to be remembered. And I think there's also a specific reason why certain people are trying to remove that from our history.
Yeah, amen on that.
Yeah, thank you so much. Well said, Brian, and thank you. Really appreciate to both Brian and Shane for giving us some labor history. Like I say, we can never get enough of it, and it only stays alive through us. We're going to wrap this segment, but I welcome you both to stay on the line because I think you're gonna see. I actually hadn't planned this, but things are all connected, as it turns out. So let me just thank you both. Shane Riddle with the Virginia Education Association, Brian Peyton with Teamsters 322. We will continue to follow this issue. You can find out more about it. Their website, virginiaisforlabor.com. Lots of information there. And again, we're probably going to have them back on the show.